You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and now it's time for the Paranormal Peep Show.
Hi, welcome to the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Myself, Neil Ward, and fellow host Andy Chaplin. Andy, how are you?
Hello, yeah, how you doing, Neil? I noticed you've dropped the Geddes. Where's the Geddes gone?
Yeah, it fell off in the typo, yeah. Now, what's happened there is, I was born Neil Ward, right? And when I married a lady called Alison Geddes, we co-wrote this book. I was just talking to our guest about it prior to us recording. Called Fairycraft, and when she married me, she wanted to be called Geddes Ward because her surname was Geddes. She didn't want to be called Mrs. Ward. Ward Geddes didn't sound right, so I became Geddes Ward for like 30 plus years.
Yeah,
and now I'm married again. And right, you've of course seen Monica on Skype, haven't you? And so now she's Mrs. Ward, and I'm now back to Mr. Ward. So hence the Geddes has now dropped. So there's lots of my stuff out there with my artwork saying Geddes Ward and that, and I've got to get it into my head that I'm now just Neil Ward, and it's a false habit. I might call myself Geddes Ward or whatever that. So apologies to everybody if you get slightly confused. But yes, that's where my name's disappeared to. I've had a weird experience, which I thought I'd tell you about and see what you make of it, because we like weird experiences. Now, obviously, I look at YouTube a lot, and on YouTube, I look at stuff like UFOs, anything like that, ghosts, blah, 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 blah. Not really interested. I like looking at Star Trek stuff because I'm a fan of Star Trek. Occasionally, I'll see an interview or something about a film or whatever like that. But some weird reason, when I switched on my phone yesterday or the day before, I think it was yesterday, in fact, up on my YouTube feed of suggested things to watch. You'd think, oh, it'd be UFOs or Star Trek or the rock band I follow. It was just watch this film about Jack Hargreaves. Now, don't know if you recall the name Jack Hargreaves, do you?
Remind me.
Yeah, okay. He used to present two shows, to my knowledge, when I was a kid in the 70s. One was called How, and it used to be Fred Dinage, who used to do World of Sport on a Saturday.
This is one Davis. Neil, I was born in 1977.
Yeah, I know. So How used to be this series of like four people, all in their mid-40s, I suppose, at the time. I think Jack Hargreaves was perhaps the oldest. I don't know how old he was, but he was an old guy at the time, I seem to recall. And it used to be like, how do you do this? Or how do you do that? Or how does one speak this language? And they used to answer questions between them. And Jack Hargreaves was one of the presenters. Then he did a series by himself called Out of Town with Jack Hargreaves. It was all about living in the country or something like that. And anyway, I thought, well, bloody hell, why have I got that on my feed of suggestions to watch? I mean, yeah, I remember the guy from TVB years ago, but why does it come up as a suggestion? I've not even thought about the guy, but there he is. And it's like, that's weird. And then today, I happened to bump into a chap, and we're talking about stuff. Randomly, he just threw in the thing, oh, don't suppose you remember Jack Hargreaves, do you? And I thought, oh my God, what's going on here? And I said, well, yeah, I do actually, Out of Town and How. And he goes, yeah. He says, he was born in this area or something, meaning Dorset. He's sort of pointing out this area, Dorset, I was in, and his ashes are scattered around here. So he just happened to mention, I'm thinking, what's the odds of that I get this thing of Jack Hargreaves come up on my phone, would you like to watch it on YouTube? And I've not even wanted to watch it. And then this bloke mentions him the next day, and I'm like, what's going on here? That's just so freaky. But then we try and look in for deeper meanings of it. And you think, what's the point of looking at the deeper meaning? It doesn't mean anything, maybe. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
I think the meaning in it is what we make of it. So it's a subjective thing. I mean, you can never really kind of scientifically quantify this. They'll always, the skeptics or the scientists will always say, "Oh, well, it's just a strange coincidence." But it is odd when you get things like the quite specific things, and then you bump into somebody who's,
Yeah.
I'll tell you what's freaking me out at the moment is that I'll be thinking things or be wanting to find out about things, and it's popping up as adverts on Facebook or kind of articles on Facebook.
So it's like your thoughts are creating the adverts.
And it's like, I suppose if you take the Darren Brown perspective, it would be there's something there that's triggered me to think something, and then it's leading on from that. So maybe it's influencing me, but I'm not sure it is, because there's some things that are quite abstract that I've thought about that have nothing to do with anything that I post, and the little ads come up and there they are.
Yeah. See, that's like the Jack Hargreaves thing. What's going on there? I mean, the other weird experience I had, and I think I've mentioned this before on the show, was once when I was, I had gone into McDonald's, and I'm not a McDonald's person really, but I've gone in to grab a coffee, and I hadn't been into McDonald's for years, and I was really surprised about all the technology that had happened since the last time I'd gone into McDonald's. These great big screens of
I hate that.
service,
So annoying.
And I thought, my God, this is McDonald's now. My God, this is so high tech. And then I started thinking, well, this is like the Back to the Future films.
Yeah.
This is what it's like. This is how it's changed. And then as I was getting the coffee, because I was going to do a long journey on the motorway to Dorset, I was thinking, Back to the Future films, they were quite good, actually. I really enjoyed them, And then I got in the car and started driving. And I was thinking, now I really like Back to the Future 1, but I thought Back to the Future 2 was really cool. And Back to the Future 3 was a bit confusing, or whatever it was. And as I was driving, I started to overtake this truck on the motorway because it was going slow. And as I overtook it, it had on the back of it, because it was a pickup truck, the actual DeLorean time machine car from Back to the Future. As I overtook it, I thought, what on earth is going on here? That was just so freaky as well.
It's mental, and it's like there's no, you can't say that this is a scientifically provable thing, but that's a coincidence that was meant to happen by the universe, because it will always come down to, oh, well, it's just a coincidence, but it's a freaky coincidence of all the things that you could have been thinking about, because you could have been thinking about Jurassic Park or, Terminator or something, but no, you're Back to the Future.
Yeah. It's just like somehow my psychic side, or I don't know, you're trying to explain it and you just get into deeper waters. Anyway, I think it's about time we brought on our guest, because we're going to get into deeper waters now. Probably go do our head spin, because we're going into territory that we haven't really covered before.
Oh, I need to mention one thing before.
Yes, go for it.
This is quite an important thing, actually. This was kept under wraps for quite a while. I probably mentioned that I was going to be on TV and do a little bit of TV work. That's actually now happened. That's been aired. So my tune-in events team were on Midsummer Murders, and it was Series 22, Episode 6, The Angels of... the Witches of Angels Rise, and we were basically hired as the background psychic fair team.
I remember you filming it, telling me about that. So that's out now.
That's out now.
Yeah, Monica and I took part in Midsummer Murders, so we were very interested to hear that. So that's cool.
Yeah.
So did you enjoy taking part?
It was an absolute dream bliss job. The cast and crew absolutely lovely. Did a few little cheeky readings from quite well-known faces, so that's kind of confidential, obviously, but that's quite interesting. And they fed us, looked after us. We got paid. It was just an amazing venue and amazing people. It was an absolute dream job, that was.
Well, we'll have to look out for that then.
Yeah,
we can watch it on catch up or something.
You can indeed. I'm a big player.
Excellent. All right, I'll do that. So we'll get to our guest now. So we're going to be talking the strange world of fairies and associated things like that, which is a subject I'm interested in particularly. So welcome to Simon Young, joining us from Italy. Hello, Simon. Are you there?
Hi, guys. Great to be with you. So listen, I was going to ask you a small favour. You've been talking about coincidences, and could I even start with an amazing coincidence that happened to me in the last year?
Yeah.
Andy was talking before about skeptics. You'll find out that I'm pretty skeptical about many of these issues, but I am still wrestling with the magnitude of what happened this day. I was in Britain for a conference. It was in Knaresborough, Yorkshire, and I met up with a friend from university. Now, I'm 50, so this friend of mine was someone I used to spend a lot of time with in my late teens, early 20s. But it was great to meet up. And we walked through Knaresborough, and he said he would take me to the hall where the conference was taking place. And as we were walking along, we were talking about a third friend of ours, a shared friend, who at university we used to hang around with a lot. And we walked into this hall in Knaresborough, and as often happens, it's a community hall, a beautiful place. There was a big billboard. And of course, you get these great billboards. And I wanted to show off, I think, a little bit. So I walked over to the billboard to show my friend where I was featuring on the conference list, these small moments of glory. And instead, I was absolutely flabbergasted that in the middle of the billboard, there was an advert for a prenatal class with a man who looked incredibly like our shared friend. And I took it, I had a double take, looked at this, and then I looked at the guys. This man was massaging a woman's back. It was obviously a prenatal class. And it was my friend. It was my friend 15 years ago when his wife, because I recognized his wife, when she was pregnant, and he was massaging her back. And, these things you do courses and they ask that innocent question, do you mind we use any photographs for commercial purposes? And somehow, somewhere on the edge of London, this photograph had been taken, and 15 years later had turned up in the Yorkshire Health Authority's advert. And I was just astounded by this. It really took my breath away. And the sting in the story is this, that my friend and I, we just stared at this and we didn't really know what to say. And then we said goodbye to each other, and I went home, and we were so blown away by this that we're both fairly skeptical, in inverted commas, rational people. And we both started thinking about this, and independently we came to the same conclusion, that as we are both jokers, clearly the other one had fixed this up. Yeah? And so the next time we met, we both simultaneously accused each other of setting this up. But of course, we've been in touch then with our friend, and no, this photograph really was him. And it was just one of these moments that when I am too skeptical, I think back to the prenatal class poster and learn modesty. Anyway, over to you guys.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because as you talk about that one, another weird coincidence that I've not experienced, but I heard about. My friend, who's now sadly passed on, he used to watch the Richard and Judy show back in the day, and they had a phone-in about coincidences. And he rang me up to tell me about one of the phone-in callers that had reported their coincidence. And the story was that this couple had gone on holiday somewhere in the UK. And unfortunately, whilst they were on holiday, they'd been involved in a car accident, which meant that the wife had to then spend the rest of the holiday actually in hospital in wherever they were, Devon or wherever they may have been, I'm not sure. And so they were, the husband would be visiting her every day while she's being patched up and everything. And the husband said to the matron, oh, do you have anything we could do, like puzzles or games or something to stop us going bored? And the matron says, well, you can do this jigsaw puzzle here, in the cupboard. But unfortunately, the box lid is missing. So they said, oh, anything to keep our minds active. So it's like 1,000-piece jigsaw, so the story went. And they're putting it together over the course of a few days. And as they put it together, they realised that as the picture built up of the jigsaw, it was a place they'd been to on holiday, like the previous year or something. But then as they put the final pieces into the jigsaw, they were astonished to see themselves actually in the jigsaw. Yeah, actually in the photo of the jigsaw.
That's mad.
That's mad, isn't it? Mad, yeah. But I mean, I can't verify that. There's only a story that my friend had told me because he'd seen it on the TV. So that's called hearsay, and skeptics will always say, oh, it's hearsay, but there we go.
But look, you're absolutely right, Neil. This was what was going through my mind. This is how us skeptics distort things, of course, ourselves. But I thought, look, Neil's telling me this. He got this from his friend who got it allegedly. But what's great is this experience I had. I just can't get around it. It happened too.
Yeah.
And I wish I could somehow delete it because it would make life simpler. But it happened.
Yeah. But it would make life more boring, surely.
It would. I agree.
It's like the Carl Jung thing where the lady was being treated by Carl Jung, or was it Sigmund Freud? I can't remember which one of the psychoanalysts it was. And they're talking about, oh, I had a dream of a something or other moth, weird moths, you know. And at that moment, the very sort of moth that she was describing in the dream flew into the window or something, you know. And he goes, what, like this or something, or a beetle or a scarab beetle. It was something weird insect that was extremely rare. And as she talked about it, it actually flew into the window and landed on the table or something.
My memory is it was the death head's moth or something.
Yeah,
like this.
yeah. I thought it was a moth or a beetle. I couldn't remember. A friend of mine told me about it, which I thought was a real freaky one. But yeah. So yeah, he's a man. You know, Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung would be the guy that would like really look into the deep side of that. And
Do you know what they fell out over?
What was it?
So Jung basically had an experience. The experience goes that he walked into some kind of chapel in Italy, I think it was, whilst on holiday.
By coincidence, where Simon is talking from now.
Yeah. And he was looking up at this wonderful, amazing paintings. I forgot what they call it, mural or whatever, on the ceiling. It's wonderful paintings. And he comes out and he speaks to somebody that either owns it or curates it or something. And he says, you know, tell me more information about the wonderful painting. And they said, what painting? Oh, the painting in the ceiling. Well, there is no painting in the ceiling. They went back. And basically it was completely deteriorated and there was nothing there. But it turns out that there was actually a painting previously and it had just been deteriorated or painted over or just crumbled away. So basically the idea is that Jung might have had like a time slip. And Freud basically said, that's impossible. Science, that can't happen. And that's why they parted company.
Oh, right, okay.
So the story goes.
Oh, I thought it was just a Freudian slip. So, as we mentioned Italy, Simon, that's where you're now residing. So, you're teaching, you're a teacher, a lecturer, aren't you? Is that correct?
That's right. So really, I'm a historian. And over the years, I've supported myself by writing and by teaching. These are the two things I do. And over the years, I've taught various subjects. And in the last 10 years or so, I've specialised in the history of the supernatural. But, and this is a common curse of university level teachers, I've never actually taught that subject. So I've taught history of the Second World War, fascism, aspects of Italian food, history of Christianity, Renaissance history, you know, everything you can imagine, but never actually the subject I'm an expert in.
And how did you become interested in the fairy kind of stuff that you've kind of done this Fairy Census, I understand, which is people's accounts and you collate them together. Would that be right?
That's right, yeah. So when I was at university, I was a specialist in the Middle Ages. And in fact, I did my doctorate in that as well. So I guess in my late 20s, early 30s, I was a medievalist. And at that point, I became really quite ill. And I had 2 or 3 really bad years where things were very dicey. And it was one of those happy events where I came out the other end of the tunnel. But by then, I felt I couldn't go back to studying what I'd been studying. It was just almost as if there was a kind of a revulsion. And so at that point, I began to look at particularly fairy lore. I'd always been interested in folklore and fairy lore from when I was in my teens. But I went back to look at that, and slowly I started to write about it in a very amateurish fashion. And then I began to publish academic articles on it, and I became more and more interested. And finally, yes, I got to this business that you're referring to, the Fairy Census, where in 2014, I started this survey. So this is where I stepped outside of the role of the historian. And I looked for contemporary experiences of fairy encounters. So I invited people who'd seen fairies or had some kind of fairy experience to write and do a survey on my website. And I collated these. And in 2017, I published the first 500. And these are freely available online. And I just yesterday, finished the second volume. And it's still got to be edited, but it's basically finished. And that will soon be published, and that too will be freely available online.
Wow. So you've said yourself you're a skeptic as such, Matt. So when these people like write in their fairy experiences, are you kind of like looking at it with a skeptical eye, or are you sort of thinking, is there something to this that you maybe haven't become aware of or anything like that?
Well, when I say I'm a skeptic, I like to think I'm a small s skeptic. When I listen to Richard Dawkins or someone, I become very irritated.
I haven't got time for this rubbish.
This is I mean, I suspect often people like this are right, but I dislike intensely their certainties. And one of the things I always try very hard to do is keep an open mind on everything, even though I think probably I'm just hardwired to be skeptical, rational in inverted commas. However, of course, a little bit like this coincidence I described at the beginning, when you're reading experience after experience, it is true that my brain filters it in this way. How can you explain that? Yeah. And then there are a whole series of events where I have problems explaining it, where either you get to the point where you're saying this person has just made this up, which I think on rare occasions is the case, but rare occasions. But there are these other cases where you just think, well, clearly this was an extraordinary experience, and it's outside my understanding how you would explain this. And what I want to do in the Fairy Census is really put down all this evidence in one place. So skeptics, believers, folklorists, all different people can look at this stuff and come to their own conclusions, but they have the data there in as useful a fashion as possible.
So I was going to ask if you've actually seen a fairy, but I'm guessing from what you said, the answer is probably no.
Look, I think I'm going to give you a disturbing answer to this. I think this is how we filter information in our brains, which is something I find fascinating. I have had in my life, I've just had my 50th birthday. I have had 4 or 5 supernatural experiences in my life. But of course, for me, they're not supernatural experiences. They were hallucinations. In other words, if someone else had them, they might say, oh my God, this. Whereas I start to think of them in terms of what was happening to my brain that day. What was the background to this experience? And I think filters are everything in this respect. But these experiences, modest as they were, have given me a sense of, I suppose, can we say the majesty of experiences like this? The way that experiences like this can change your life. The way that this thing can happen to you, and it can just be a turning point, that nothing is the same again.
Yeah. This
is one of the reasons I find these experiences so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually had some experiences that are so mind blowing I can never go back to it. I won't go into it too much because I've said it so many times, but I suppose you could call it technically poltergeist experiences where objects have moved in the vicinity, and I've seen shadows and orbs with the naked eye right in front of me. And as you say, you can't go back. You can try and rationalize it as much as you possibly can, but at the end of the day, there's no logical explanation for some things that you see.
That's interesting. I mean, with the Fairy Census, was anything like of a common denominator coming through in all these kind of accounts that you could sort of pinpoint? They've all, drunk a certain tea, and that's maybe caused the problem, or they were in a certain state of mind. I mean, did you ask like 20 questions that went with each account, or they just literally wrote their account and you had to break each one down to analyze it?
No, my memory is there are 35 questions. I mean, if you, let's say for the sake of argument, Andy, that you decided that one of these orb experience was actually a fairy experience.
That's fine, yeah.
But you could go to the Fairy Census, and I'm afraid, and I sometimes feel a bit apologetic for this, it will take you at least 15 minutes to do the census, because apart from the description, there are all these questions. And one of the things I said at the beginning, I was inspired by 2 earlier fairy surveys, one from the 1910s and one from the really 50s to 90s. But both of these, the whole point of them was to prove the existence of fairies. I started off with the idea that that was just impossible. Not because fairies don't exist, but just because they're not amenable to that kind of study. Whereas what I wanted to do was pinpoint exactly what you were saying, Neil, the people, the kind of people and the kind of circumstances in which people have experiences. And so, yeah, there were lots of factors. For instance, there was, I mean, just to give you the most banal, explain this to me. 70% of the 1,000 people who have now answered the Fairy Census have spent this time, have written stuff out, are women. I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean that women are more likely to have these experiences? Does it mean that women are more likely to process these experiences, quote unquote, fairies? Or is it just that men feel stupid writing down about these experiences? And of course, you can play with this data, but that's an example of a piece of data that really sticks out.
What strikes me as well is it's interesting you say that some people might have seen the orbs that I've seen and interpreted them as fairies. I wonder how widespread that is with all sorts of things. So, for instance, if you take, I don't know if you believe in like alien abductions and kind of like contact with greys and that kind of thing. If somebody from the medieval era were to see a UFO or to see an alien, they might call it, I don't know, a metal sky ship. And they might call an alien a demon. And in actual fact, a good example of this actually was the first recorded and certainly drawn out in terms of an illustration crop circle was quite near me in a village called Wollerton. And it was a crop circle that appeared in a farmer's field. Now, back then, the medieval people called it something like the mowing devil. And they had a picture of the devil with his little horns and a scythe, kind of like chopping away and creating a perfect circle. Now, that was the medieval interpretation of what they thought they were seeing in terms of like the crop circles. But if we wind that over to nowadays, now we attribute that to UFOs and aliens and little grey men and that kind of thing. But is it the same thing but a different interpretation of it?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that comes through very clearly in the Fairy Census in this sense. So I began in 2014 and we're now, in 2023. And already, because you've got lots and lots of numbers, you can see trends, not just within a period, but through a period. And for example, something I find fascinating is what are sometimes called BOLs, balls of light, which can include orbs or ball lightning. I mean, can include lots of different possibilities, are increasingly interpreted as fairies. Whereas in the 80s and 90s, they were often associated more with ghosts. And so you can definitely see these trends. And then, of course, like Andy says, you have the much more radical versions of this, where if you go back, you can see people describing something that would just be maybe described in similar terms, but understood in very different terms today. And personally, and I'm not sure to what extent we'd agree on this, but I have the suspicion that the supernatural is a very wide area. And what we assign to categories, fairies, aliens, I know this is controversial, but Sasquatch, for me, in the end, this is part of one macro family. And when they crop up in one category or other, I assume that very similar mechanisms are going on. Now, whether that's right or not, I don't know. But this is the assumption, maybe the lazy assumption that I make.
I'm glad you brought up Sasquatch, actually, because I used to just put that down to just fanciful thinking and just crazy, I don't know, hillbillies. But the thing is, there's quite a few podcasts that I listen to, such as The Confessionals and Real Life Ghost Stories. And there were a hell of a lot of very rationally minded, very grounded people who have seen these things. You know, we're talking like sheriffs and game wardens and hunters, you know, people that know the countryside, they know the bush, they know the difference between a deer and something else. Sure. And they come across what they can only describe as these 10-foot tall or 9-foot tall, great big reddish hairy beasts. And it's just so bizarre. And it's just, you know, are all of these people lying, or is there something to it? Is there something very odd going on?
That's if I can just interject, and then over to you, Simon. Just whilst we're on this point, there's something very interesting regarding the Sasquatch, because about a month ago, I met just very briefly a lady from the United States, and I said, "Oh, what part of the United States are you from?" And she said, "Oh, Washington State, which is in the Pacific Northwest, and that's very big Sasquatch reports and things like that." So I kind of said, "Oh, have you seen Bigfoot?" You know, as a kind of off-the-cuff remark, you know, as a kind of jokey thing. She goes, "No, but I've seen signs in the state that say it's illegal to shoot Bigfoot. It's been put up by the local government. It is illegal to shoot Sasquatch or Bigfoot in this state." Bloody hell, that's interesting. Anyway, over to you, Simon.
Well, no, I mean, I agree with everything that's just been said. I think to just assume that all of these people are making this stuff up, I think that's the one absolutely not convincing answer to this. Now, how you actually explain what they're seeing, that's another question. And there, again, my suspicion is that there isn't a huge primate living in the woods of North America. But what we're seeing here is something very similar to the way that people saw fairies in the British woodlands before. In other words, this is some kind of supernatural projection. Maybe it really exists. Maybe it's something that's projected by our brains, but that this is part of this wider supernatural family. Again, this is my lazy assumption, but I agree absolutely with Andy. You do not have scores of people making this stuff up. These are real experiences. Now, how you explain those experiences is another question, but these are real experiences.
There's another spanner to add in the works. Apparently, statistically, people who have seen Sasquatch also in the vicinity have seen UFO activity. Yeah. Are they connected? Don't know. Don't know. So
it's an interesting point.
So if you look at, for instance, apparently there's a correlation. If you look at the instances of UFO reports and people encountering UFOs and even the ET side of things, those seem to cross-correlate with Sasquatch sightings in terms of geography and location.
So if I can chip in there, one of the most interesting questions in the Fairy Census, and one that I would love to work more on, is the Fairy Census asks this: which category would you put yourself in? You have three possibilities. Are you A person who never or almost never has supernatural experiences, B, a person who occasionally has supernatural experiences, or C, a person who regularly has supernatural experiences? And I think this is, if I was studying Sasquatch or UFOs, this is actually a question I would ask, or perhaps the wording would be different depending on the sector. But I think it becomes very interesting when people who have these experiences actually also have experiences in other areas. So, for example, a question at the end of the Fairy Census is, how do you know that this was a fairy and not an alien or something else or a ghost? And I'm always fascinated by how many people say, no, well, I've experienced aliens and ghosts and they feel different.
Yeah.
And, for me as a fairly pedestrian, run-of-the-mill person, I find an answer like that incredible. But there are clearly some people who have this very wide range of experiences. And if you just get a simple UFO account or a simple Sasquatch account, that sometimes can be lost to sight. But I think that's part of the story.
Interesting. I mean, I'm wondering how many people, especially kind of like medieval era, growing upwards, would actually maybe let's assume that spirits are for real, and let's assume that little orbs are for real. I know that they are because I've seen them, but let's just kind of like take that as a given in this instance. How many people would have seen these spiritual orbs and these little kind of sprites and attributed, oh, well, that's a fairy, that must be a fairy, when it could be, I don't know, an energy of a spirit?
Sure, I think absolutely. And if you go back to medieval records, what we think of as will-o'-the-wisp is very, very often associated with fairies. If you look at early modern references to fairies, again and again, they're described as carrying lights. Yeah. So this would confirm what you're saying. This is how people would have processed these things. And if I can just throw, as Andy said before, another spanner in the works, something I find really interesting is when we look at these really bizarre experiences, this is what they are, they're out of the ordinary. You also have what some people call the deep weird experiences, the really, really bizarre experiences. And I think that what happens is Joe Bloggs tomorrow, walking through Loughborough in the middle of Britain, has a weird experience. His job is to put it in one of our categories. Is this a ghost? Is this an alien? Is this a fairy? If he's an evangelical Christian, is it a demon? What category will he put it in? And what I would say is, in every period of history, there is a miscellaneous category. In other words, there are things that happen that are just so mind-boggling that they just don't really fit into any category. And in the Middle Ages, that was the demon category. If something happened that was just like, what was that? It just doesn't really comply with other things that we've read about. It must be a demon. And to some extent, I think today the fairy category has become the miscellaneous category, in as much as in the Fairy Census, you sometimes have references that are just so weird. And I think, why did this person think this is a fairy? But then I think, well, what else? How else could you explain that? I mean, I get it. And I'll give you one example from Ireland that really sticks in my mind from the second Fairy Census. And again, this would be out in a couple of weeks, a month, 6 weeks at most. And this reference is about two guys. They go to a disco, one of the Midland Irish counties, and they're waiting for the bus to come home. So I guess this is about midnight. Two guys together, and this is really interesting. It's not a solitary encounter. And at a certain point, one of them's looking up at the street light, and he sees going from a street light across to another street light what he describes as a spider web. And he starts thinking, that's impossible. This is 10 yards. How can you have a spider? And why is the spider web glowing? Yeah. And at this point, the spider web, and I think here my description starts to be inadequate, but because the experience was just so unusual, the spider web, I think, descends to the ground, and he goes and he puts his hand in the spider web and it's this luminescent material. And a few minutes later, his mom arrives. This is, a great late teen experience because the bus didn't turn up. And so kindly mom got out of bed and went to pick up these two reprobates. And they get in the car, and his mom remembers him talking about the experience. And he asked his friend after a couple of months, and his friend had a vague memory, but he couldn't really put his finger on it. And yet this guy thinks, well, maybe it's something to do with the fairies, and maybe it is. But this is an example about how we struggle to put weird experiences in categories. I mean, this is what we do. We're human. We need categories. We feel more at ease with categories. But it's worth remembering, I think, that first of all, Andy's point that different periods have different categories. And secondly, maybe often these categories are more our creation than the universe's creation. That would be my take.
So now we go in the direction of tulpas, and we know about tulpas.
I know what tulpas are, but do you want to explain for the audience?
Yeah, so for people who don't know what tulpas are, it's the idea goes that human consciousness and people who are able to manifest reality can create entities and ethereal beings. So, for instance, there was a group of people that got together and decided they were going to create a fictional character called, I think it was David or something.
I think Philip is the Philip experiment.
Yeah,
yeah,
a monk or something.
Wasn't he a pirate, or have I got mixed up? It was in Toronto.
Monk.
Okay, sorry, no, I think he's Toronto, but
yeah,
a monk in Toronto.
But it was basically they created a backstory, and they had a Ouija board session, and over a period of time, they actually created and manifested this entity into being, into consciousness. So yeah, very odd.
It started being naughty. It was good at first, but then after a time, it started being a bit of a misdemeanor or something, and hard to handle. So I don't know if they terminated the experiment or.
There's actually a book on that experiment. I mean, it's very well documented what Andy's saying. It's a fascinating experience. And for example, one of the things the group found was that they found it helped to sing before they did the group experiment. It was what we could very crudely call a Ouija board when they started out. And they found that they needed to get this communal spirit going. I mean, it's a fascinating example. Yeah, I mean, tulpas, again, I think it's originally a Tibetan expression, and there are lots of these examples from Tibetan tradition of meditating monks accidentally creating thought forms. And I'll just throw out there one famous British example where it's sometimes been suggested that we're dealing with a tulpa. What we could call fairy forms often take on surprisingly familiar examples. Sorry, I've said this a little bit wrong. what we call fairy forms often take on surprisingly familiar and unfairy-like forms. And in 1979, in late September, is it 29th of September, a group of kids, both of you will know this stuff backwards, at Wollerton.
The gnomes.
Yeah, this is the famous Wollerton Gnomes incident. And I've just, a couple of months ago, I put out the second edition of this book on the Wollerton Gnomes. It's a fascinating case. But what's amazing about this case in terms of what the kids saw, however you explain it, is they saw 30 cars with gnomes, with 2 gnomes in, driving around in the pitch black. And of course, anyone who grew up, I think, I'm trying to remember, Andy, did you say you were born in 77?
That's right, yeah.
I think you might be just outside the margin for this, but I was born in 73. And for me, immediately, the first thing I think is Noddy. Yeah.
I do remember seeing Noddy. It was,
yeah. This is the stuff that we grew up with. There were 2 gnomes in a little sports car. And this is what these kids described, just 30 of them instead of 1. And of course, in fairy theory, many fairy believers, the great Marjorie Johnson, for example, who did the greatest 20th century collection of fairy experiences, she said that fairies love imitating things that they see. And this is how she explains these very familiar forms. But maybe tulpas is another possibility there.
That's interesting, because I think it was reading about the Wollerton Gnomes that led me to you, Simon, reading your account. And did any of the kids come forward in later life to kind of talk about that experience, to your knowledge?
Well, we tried. I say this a little bit, not with shame, but with some embarrassment. I tried to track them down, and I did so through the newspaper. And I did this on a couple of occasions. And I mean, I'll repeat the call now. If you were there on that night, if you were one of the 11 kids, guys, get in touch. I offer you a safe space. If need be, I offer you a confessional. But my suspicion is these kids don't want to be found. And I've discovered a few things about a couple of the kids. And I don't want to say this, obviously, in a public space. They've gone on, they've done their lives. But yeah, I did try and track them down, and I failed. And I think for anyone who's interested in the Wollerton Gnomes, and here, shameless plug, again, there is this book edited by S.R. Young, this is me, which has all the sources for the Wollerton Gnomes and about 7 essays by different Forteans and folklorists in. And what makes this case special? There are 2 things about it. First of all, it's one of these fascinating cases where a group of kids have a supernatural experience together. Now, there are not loads of these, but there are a number, but it's a special category, and it's a very interesting category. But the reason it really, really stands out is that we just have such incredible sources for it. I mean, this was a case where these kids went out, had their wild moment on Sunday night, ran around with these gnomes, and then went to school, told everyone about it, and on Tuesday, the headmaster sat 3 of the 4 kids down who'd had the central experience and recorded them. And in the book, there is the transcript of this interview. So we have something that was recorded within 48 hours of the experience by a clearly intelligent man who wanted to get at the truth and did this really, first-class interview. And then in the days afterwards, first of all, the Nottingham press, then the national press were all over this. So we have the newspaper reports as well. And the newspaper reports, for example, went and talked to the kids' parents. There's one great line, I think it's one of the kids was called Patrick, and a Sun journalist said to Patrick's mom, "So did he see the gnomes?" And she said words to the effect of course he didn't, you idiot." So, you had all these different opinions. Patrick's sister was interviewed and she said, "I wasn't there, but the day after I saw the gnomes too. They were up at the castle." And so there were all these interviews. And then Marjorie Johnson, who I mentioned before, who was then the head of the Fairy Investigation Society, bless her, this amazing woman, she lived in Nottingham and she carried out a survey for the Fairy Investigation Society, a city that she knew intimately very, very well. And she wrote a report. That too is in the book. And so there's all this different material we can put together. And also in the book, there are different gnome and fairy accounts from Wollerton in Nottingham. So it's if you're fascinated in these cases, whether you're a skeptic, a believer, somewhere in between, hell, whether you're Richard Dawkins, it's an amazing case because we've got so much evidence.
I remember after reading about the Wollerton gnomes, I kind of expanded my search of it and came across, perhaps you've come across them anyway, other cases. For instance, I forget the year, but it was maybe like in the last, maybe it's in the 1920s or 30s, a lady was in the same park, Wollerton Park, walking around, and she thought she saw 3 small men in like the lodge at the big edge of the park or something, and they're all smiling to her, and she thought they were like small policemen or something.
This
they showed her
Marjorie
around
Johnson.
This is the lady, yeah.
Right, so it's not Marjorie Johnson, but it's Marjorie Johnson reporting
the
an
account.
experience that she came across.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things here is, I think even if we go full Richard Dawkins and we're very, very skeptical, it is clear that there was some kind of tradition of fairy experiences in the park. And I don't know how you guys relate to this. Maybe as someone who's interested in fairy lore, this touches on something that fascinates me. But the thing about Wollerton Park is it's a green island in an urban area, in a conurbation. Nottingham's perhaps not a conurbation, no, but it's surrounded by red roofs. So it's this quite big park, absolutely surrounded in an urban area. And there are other areas in Britain that have a similar supernatural series of experiences. A great example from Greater Manchester is Boggethole Clough, which again is surrounded by houses for a couple of miles on both sides. Another example up in the lowlands of Scotland is Arthur's Seat, which is now this wonderful wild area, but surrounded by houses. And another example, I was talking to a British fairist about this recently, is Central Park in New York. Another huge green area, but surrounded by urban life. And these areas, for whatever reason, are quite often associated with supernatural experiences, fairies and otherwise. And I find that fascinating. I'm not sure why that is.
I just love the word various.
I love the word various.
Now, and also, again, going back to the gnomes, there was another lady of an account I read. I think this lady lived in Devon, and this was pre-noddy times. She woke up to hear a strange noise in her garden, like at midnight or something. She looked out the window, and she said she saw a gnome-like figure literally driving round and round and round in circles in a car in her garden, until eventually it kind of faded away or something. And this was pre-Enid Blyton times. I can't remember what year it was, but I was thinking, because obviously I read the account of the kids, thinking, oh, well, maybe there's some noddy influence there watching a TV show or something. Yeah. But this was pre-noddy that this lady was talking about seeing gnomes, which I thought was interesting. Now, another weird thing, some years ago, going back about 20 years ago, because Andy and I do sort of psychic readings and mediumship and that sort of stuff. And so I was doing a reading for a guy, and the weird thing about it is that I was expecting to tune into the afterlife as we kind of think of it, granddads, mothers, fathers in the spirit world or whatever. But I felt this a small being standing next to him, and I couldn't quite work out what was going on. And I said, look, I got this weird thing that's standing next to you, and I can feel it. I can't see it, but I sense it's small. And it wants to talk to you. And he goes, oh, that will be the gnome. I said, what? And he said, he had a psychic reading from another lady who said that there's this gnome that follows him about or something. And so maybe, I'm just saying maybe, because I'm not saying it's definite, maybe I was picking up that same thing that people have interpreted as a gnome, for want of a better description. But I don't know what it is. And getting back to the thing about the Philip Tolper thing, where these people found that they had to sing to get this thing to manifest or whatever it was going to do. Interestingly enough, in spiritualist churches normally, they all have a sing-song, don't they, Andy, to raise the energy?
Yeah. And do you know what? I've been involved in ghost hunts and involved with deliberately trying to kind of like bring spirit forth, where they do precisely that. People sing, ring-a-ring around the roses, or they'll sing all sorts of things in order to get the energy out. Yeah, it's interesting.
Can I chip in and ask Andy there? I'm always really curious about these cases, Andy. So let's say that the three of us get together, maybe a couple more people. You talk about singing. What other, for example, would it help us to have a bottle of wine?
What to drink?
Seriously, I mean, no, I'm really curious.
Well, when you say bottle of wine, do you mean to drink the bottle of wine, or to do something with it, or
No, just to have a glass of wine each. Would
Get merry.
get merry?
Okay.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the reason why alcohol spirits are called spirits are because the shamans used to drink them and connect with spirit. That's why. So they would get absolutely. Are we allowed to swear, Neil?
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, well, they used to get shit-faced, basically, some of the shamans. Not all, but some shamans. And they used to basically connect with spirit that way. Now, from my own personal experience, I, growing up in the spiritualist community, was told that don't mix spirits with spirits. You don't get drunk and then communicate with spirits. However, I would say that there have been some instances where I've been in a pub and I've been quite happy and I've been quite merry, and I have actually given little readings to people, and they have actually been fairly decent. So it seems that the alcohol situation can sometimes help, but I don't think you should get blitzed and do it. I think kind of tipsy is probably the right thing. So in other words, the short answer is yes, but not blitzed, but tipsy, I think, yes. Because also the other thing is that your skepticism, your rational mind, the barriers that might block interact are down. And so there's maybe a more connection, which is also why I think people, when they do mushrooms or LSD or some other kind of mind-altering transcendental drugs, also have the ability sometimes to connect with spirit and other beings as well.
Yeah. So, but if we were going to create a list of things to help this process along, we have singing, we have maybe moderate alcohol consumption. Would there be anything else?
I would say personally meditation. I think within the spiritualist community, certainly before we connected with spirit, we went into like a meditation. Stating an intention, I think, is a really important one, because I think if you don't state intention, then you could get all sorts. You could get some quite nasty stuff through. And I think when you state your intention, you state the vibration that you're at. So if you want love and you want wisdom and enlightenment, and that's your intention, then cross fingers, hopefully that's what you get. A lot of people, when they join things like the most haunted style, kind of run around screaming things because their intention is they want to be scared and they want thrills and spills. That's when they're going to start connecting with the lower vibrations who are going to screw with them, basically. So intention. What do I want to connect with? How do I want this to go? What do I want as the end result? Is the end result proof that there's something out there? Is the end result being scared? Is the end result some kind of wisdom or advice for future on a personal basis or for mankind? So there's a lot of the kind of tangled web of kind of layers with all of this, really.
What's your opinion? I mean, with the basic description of fairy, it obviously seems to change with the ages and interpretations. I presume geographically, people might perceive fairies around the world, if they give them that name anyway, little people, wee people, small folk, or whatever. Do they have does it change geographically in the descriptions of what these beings are, if anyone's actually physically sighted them? I mean, we talked about the spiders were between two lights earlier, and the guy thought, well, maybe it must be a fairy because I'm in Ireland and that's what they have in Ireland. And in other countries, do they call them fairies? Do they interpret these beings? I mean, do you have a solid kind of sort of template of a fairy to work from?
Yeah, this is a huge question. And let me just start with one thing. First of all, you say fairies have changed through the ages, and I'll just give you the most dramatic example of that, just in a way to crack the egg open, so we do have this sense. Before 1800, it was very, very rare for people to draw fairies with wings. At the end of the 1700s, some painters in London particularly began to do that. And in the 1800s, wings started to appear. And by 1850, they began to appear in fairy fiction for kids. The first time people see fairies with wings is in the very late 1800s, early 1900s. And then after the Second World War, you have the famous Cottingley photographs that all have wings. And these become the standard image of fairies for the next, century, really, still with us today. But it's worth remembering that if we describe I always think of her as the Tinkerbell fairy, and thinking again what Andy said before, if we go back to the Middle Ages and we show a photograph to a village, somewhere in the middle of England and say, what is this? I mean, they would never identify our Tinkerbell with what they call a fairy. And I think that it's worth remembering that fairies change. The second point, and this is true, of course, of all supernatural beings, and I don't know about aliens, but I imagine it's true of aliens as well from, say, the 50s through to today. The second point I'd make is when you go around the world today and you talk about fairies, there is, if you like, can we call it the neoliberal fairy? What can we say? The international fairy, which is basically Tinkerbell.
Yeah.
And so if you go to Guatemala, if you go to Iceland, if you go to Greece, if you go to deepest Brazil, if you go to Thailand, fairies have this form, but also the native supernatural forms have begun to be like fairies, if that makes sense. Because this is the currency, this is the international currency, this is how we imagine fairies to be. And so I was talking to a scholar, for instance, who's just written for me a very good chapter on Nereids, which are basically the Greek fairies. And you can go to Athens and you can go to a bookshop and buy a book for kids of Nereids, and they all look like Tinkerbell. Yeah? Whereas if you go back a century or even 60, 70 years and you go to Athens or you go to a country and you ask about the local fairy, in inverted commas, whatever the local name is, so it might be trolls in Denmark, elves in Iceland, Nereids in Greece, every country will have its own name, then you will find that these forms are radically different and often behave in very different ways.
Go on, Andy, did you want to ask?
I was going to say, generally speaking, this is a slight tangent, but still relevant. Generally speaking, what's the percentage of negative experiences with fairies versus positive experiences, or maybe even we could have a third category, neutral experiences?
Yeah, really interesting question. So if you go back to the Middle Ages, I would say it's kind of 98% negative.
Oh,
wow. I mean, I don't know if it's quite that high, but God, it's close. Seeing a fairy doesn't normally end well. However, if you look at the Fairy Census, one of the questions I ask is, describe the fairy's mood. And I give a series of adjectives and then invite the person to actually choose an adjective if the right one isn't there. And by far the most common adjective, well, there are two, friendly or joyful. And so it's almost as if the numbers have reversed in that sense. And there is, one of the adjectives is angry. And sometimes people describe angry fairies. And sometimes people describe bad experiences with fairies. Or sometimes people use the word mischievous, which I suppose is an anger but can have negative results if they're messing with you. But it's the modern fairy, we could say again, Tinkerbell fairy, is much more likely to sprinkle you with glitter than to cause you trouble, I would say.
When did that switch, and why and how, do you think?
Look, again, fascinating. I mean, the great thing is, Andy, that to some extent we can document this, because I've already talked twice about this amazing woman, one of my heroes, Marjorie Johnson. And Marjorie, she basically, her earliest memory was age 5, when she woke up in the morning and saw a fairy. And all through her life, right to the very end of her life, I get goosebumps talking about this woman. She saw fairies almost on a daily basis. It was clearly just part of her life. This was a high-functioning individual. She was a legal secretary. She organised the Fairy Investigation Society. She was clearly an extraordinary special woman. But right through her life, she collected fairy experiences. And from the 1930s to the 1990s, she did it in a really serious fashion. And she published this. Unfortunately, she didn't publish it. It was published after her death by Anomalous Press. And the book is called Seeing Fairies. And there were about 400 accounts. So we have from the 1930s through to the 1990s covered by Marjorie Johnson. And we then have covered by the Fairy Census from, let's say, the 2000s through to today. So we actually have almost a century of experiences that we can put together. And what I would say is, already when Marjorie Johnson was recording stuff in the 30s, fairies had already become nice. Whereas when you go to Evans Wentz, and I'm sure you both know this book, this is The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, published in 1911. Evans Wentz was this insane American who walked around Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Isle of Man, Cornwall, Brittany, making friends with local people and recording fairy experiences. I would say that there, of maybe 300-400 experiences he records, maybe 70% of the experiences are negative. So that's where the turn comes. It's somewhere around the turn of the century. And I'm sure that in traditional rural areas, it continued later. And in urban areas, fairies were nicer before. But let's say around 1900, and if you want to remember it, I think the moment where everything changes, in fairy terms, the AD moment, the moment that Christ is born, if you like, is when the Cottingley Fairies are published in 1921. Because suddenly you have these sweet, lovely winged fairies in every newspaper in the world.
Interesting.
So it seems the fairies seem to somehow switch with a kind of cultural shift, maybe, or is it our perception of them? Also, the other thing I was going to ask, I'm going to take a break in a minute, but I'm just thinking like Africa, India, Arabic places. I mean, we talk about the wee folk and the fairies and stuff like that. Do they? I mean, we talk about the international. Do they have these things, but they just call them evil little spirits, or
Completely. Yeah. They just have different names. I think one thing which is interesting, this is a personal hobby horse of mine, so I just throw it in there. But something that's special about British and Irish fairies, and to some extent the Scandinavian equivalents, is that they are highly social beings. What that means is we're in the Middle Ages. We have this little village up in the hills in I was going to say Italy, but actually with Italy it might not work. But, somewhere near Nottingham, there's a hill or there's a village in the wood. Somewhere up there, beyond the river in the wilds, the fairies have a village. And the fairies have a king and a queen. It's very similar to our existence. It's like a parallel existence. And that's something that you do not find everywhere. This is something where Britain and Ireland, traditionally with their fairies, were a little bit special. That they were highly social. They had their own society. And so often when you saw fairies, it wasn't just necessarily that you saw one in your garden walking by, but you saw a hunting party, or you saw a fairy army, or you saw fairy women washing their clothes, or another favourite one, making butter. Or the absolutely most favourite medieval fairy experience, you saw a bunch of 10 or 12 women dancing in a circle. And this is something that's a little bit special about Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia. And you do find it in some other places, but the social element is less stressed. And to some extent, the niceification, what's sometimes called the Disneyfication of the fairy, destroyed that element. The social element disappeared, but it's there in British and Irish tradition. These are social units. They're fairy societies that are connected to us. Now, Neil, can I just sneak in one last question? If we talk about ghosts, I mean, there's no question. Like fairies, ghosts change through the centuries. For instance, from ancient times till the early 1800s, in almost every Western European country, ghosts have chains. And then suddenly the chains disappear. People just stop seeing them. It's interesting. Another one, in the early modern period, you start to see lots of ghosts without heads. In the Middle Ages, that didn't happen. What I want to ask Andy, because I feel that Andy perhaps is the person who knows most about aliens. I know very, very little.
Mm.
I mean, how many years can we talk about alien sightings? 70 years? In that time, has there been a change?
Well, I mean,
There has.
the original kind of like alien, I suppose you could call it, was the little green man. But of course, recently it's not the little green man; it's the little grey man. So the colours definitely changed. Now, whether that was Hollywood getting it wrong, or whether there was an original kind of little green man that was in the 1950s or the 1940s, even, who knows? But certainly people don't really talk about the little green men. They talk about little grey men with the big bug eyes. I mean, this could go in a really interesting direction, because if you have a look at some cave paintings, you've got the classic depiction of the alien grey with the kind of the almond-shaped heads and the almond-shaped eyes. So on a technical basis, this could go back to day one when they were doing cave paintings, because I've seen cave paintings of what we would describe as aliens, including some with space helmets and space outfits.
Sure. But one of the questions that you threw at me earlier was, I think your question was, to what percentage of experiences are positive and what are negative?
Right.
When you think of the last 70 years or so, or the last century, has there been a change in the number of negative versus positive experiences, or is it pretty much the same, would you say?
I actually don't know. I don't know.
With aliens, we're talking about. And okay, well, in the earlier years, okay, I know we talk about Roswell, and they supposedly found what they call small beings with 4 fingers or something, greys, perhaps, as we commonly think of them. But in the early years, in the 50s and maybe the 60s as well, people like George Adamski and other people were supposedly getting in contact with people they were told were coming from Venus or some planet in the solar system, most typically Venus. And they would be humanoid type of people with superhuman telepathic abilities, that kind of stuff. And they're giving warnings to mankind about how we're, the Michael Rennie, the day the earth stood still kind of message, change your ways or you're going to destroy yourselves kind of message. And now, more lately, as we approach the 70s, I mean, Betty and Barney Hill being a kind of almost a pinnacle point, where it started to become well known, was the Greys. I think that was like in 1961 or something, the Betty and Barney Hill abduction incident, where they were coming back off their holiday through Canada into North America, and they were abducted like 4:30 in the morning by these beings who they described, and it became apparent that they were Greys or something. And then the Greys seemed to have took over, and these humanoid visitors seem to have kind of been, not saying they've disappeared, but it's like the Greys have become more prominent on the abduction scenario, like we want to take your eggs or something like that. Whereas the humanoid versions, the Michael Rennie types, weren't really interested in your reproductive organs. They were more interested in giving you a spiritual enlightenment kind of message, save mankind and save us with it, sort of thing.
Neil, on this is relevant. This is relevant. There's a theory that goes that aliens, for the most part, the ETs for the most part, were observing mankind. Now, there is the alien agenda of kind of like interbreeding with humans, taking eggs and sperm and that kind of thing, but they were observing mankind. What really sparked off the sightings and what really got them interested, so to speak, is when humans started developing nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons, apparently, the consciousness of certainly the positive ETs were kind of like, oh shit, the kids have got hold of the matches. The toddler's there and he's striking the matches.
Yeah, Jim Mars expression.
Yeah. These stupid morons, these monkey knuckle dragging apes, what the hell are they doing playing with nuclear? This is interesting. Apparently, Hiroshima is a hotspot for UFO activity. It's a hotspot for UFO kind of like sightings and activity. Are they monitoring what's going on with the nuclear stuff? Are they kind of like assessing how much damage a nuclear bomb has done on Earth? And to answer your question, Simon, for the positive and negative thing, this is another spanner in the works. There are some people who to begin with, had what they would describe as a negative experience. So they're being abducted against their will and they're kind of strapped down and all these kind of experiments going on. However, as they've begun to communicate with the ETs and become more comfortable with the ETs and less kind of screaming and kind of lashing out, the ETs have actually undone them, let them walk around the ship and actually started talking to them about, what the experiments are, what they're doing, where they've come from, all this kind of thing. So there's a dialogue going on. So it's drifted from a very negative experience into a positive experience. But we could also flip that round for another spanner in the works, where there's some people who have had what they believe to be positive experiences, where they're kind of like, they're into the friends and they're happy and it's all happy bunnies. But then they've gone into regression, hypnotherapy regression, and they've worked out that yes, they have had the experience of being abducted against their will, with like things going into their eyes and implants and that kind of thing. So we've got some people that started out of negative, going into what they perceive as positive, and then some people starting out as positive and then what they perceive as negative. So it's a mishmash. It's a real mishmash.
That's because they're all coming from different places. They've all got different agendas. That's
exactly how I view the ETs is how I view humans. For instance, visiting the Serengeti and viewing lions and gazelles. So you've got some humans that want to help them. So they might offer veterinary services. They might look after the animals, that feed the animals, run a sanctuary for animals. You've got some that are purely scientific and just observing. And if a lion eats a gazelle, that's just nature. That's just how it is. We're just observing. And then you've got some people with very negative agendas. So this would be your hunters and your poachers, the ones that want to shoot them and put their heads on a wall. And I think the ETs are exactly the same. Exactly the same.
Now, before we go to the break, I'll just tell this interesting story, because it really throws the whole ET thing on its head. Not the whole thing, but it just makes you think, what on earth's going on there? Preston Dennett, who we're going to have on in October at some point, he recounted this case, because Preston Dennett is a UFO author, researcher into aliens and ETs, and he's got this very interesting YouTube channel, and I listen to his stuff quite a lot, his cases, and he reported a case, and I think it was in Argentina, but I could be wrong. There's a lot of cases that for some reason turn up in Argentina. But it was a case of this guy looked out of his window in the evening and saw this humanoid being in a one-piece suit. He might have had glowing eyes. I can't remember exactly. But he had what he thought looked like either one of those, almost something like a metal detector device, but it was a square thing rather than a round thing that we have with metal detector. And he appeared to be scanning or somehow pointing it at the pile of bricks that the witness had assembled in his backyard the previous day. And this being was like, whatever he was doing to these pile of bricks. And so the witness got out his torch or flashlight and flashed it at this being to sort of like get a closer look. And it alerted the being. The being looked around and thought, shit, I've been found out or whatever. So he proceeded to walk away from him, but there was a wall in the yard where this being was. So does he fire his rocket pack or his anti-gravity boots or anything to take off? No. What he does is he steps against the wall and walks upwards like up the wall, Spider-Man style, and then flips up vertically like David Bowie in the that movie, and then walks down that way.
Wow.
What the hell's going on there? That's not exactly the quickest getaway, is it, really? But that's stylish, isn't it? Yeah, stylish getaway, yeah. So on that note, we'll take some medication and we'll have a break. So if we can resume in about, join us in a few minutes on the Paranormal Peep Show for part 2 with Simon Young. We're having a great time here talking about all sorts of weird things, fairies and ETs. See where we're going part 2. Thanks very much for the minute on the Paranormal Peep Show.
Today's the best day of my life! Woohoo! Listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Join Andy and Neil every month on the Paranormal Peep Show, part of the Paranormal UK Radio Network, for fun, frolics and lots of information about weird stuff, UFOs, ghosts and things that go bump in the night and everything associated with them. Fascinating guests, fascinating talk, fascinating information.
Hi, welcome back to the Paranormal Peep Show with myself, Neil Ward, and Andy Chaplin, and our guest, Simon Young. And we've been talking all things fairy. The Fairy Census is something that Simon's written, and he's also coming out with a follow-up to it, a Fairy Census 2, would it be? Would that be correct, Simon? Fairy Census 2?
That's right, Fairy Census 2, and that should be out in just a few weeks now.
Now, what was your decision in bringing out a second edition of Fairy Census 2? Did you feel you'd not covered enough, or you just wanted more updated stories?
I think it was a little bit like what I said to you before, that I was impressed by this fact that Marjorie Johnson had done from the 30s to the 90s. And I could see how useful it was to cover a period of time because you can see changes. And so my idea is that I want eventually to get to 2,000 experiences. And I think that that'll take me at least another decade. And if I go, so I just saw Andy's cat here. I thought I was having my own supernatural vision, and then and so my hope is to get to about 2,000 entries over the next 10 years or so. And I think that if I can put up 2,000 fairy experiences freely available on the internet, and I'll put them in PDF form and an Excel sheet so people can easily mess around with the numbers, the variables. I hope that that's something that people from lots of different backgrounds can then use for research.
Wow. Now, I was going to tell you about this story, which is my own kind of fairy story. If I can call it a fairy story, I don't really know, but maybe there's people out there that might call it a fairy story. And it's to do with a gentleman I actually met who related his own kind of encounter to me. I met him on a plane. I was flying out to Spain. I have related this story before on the Paranormal Peep Show, so apologies for those that have heard it, but I think it's pertinent to repeat it here tonight. I was heading on this plane to Spain. I was waiting for the plane to depart from Luton Airport, and all these Spaniards had got on the plane because they were heading back to Malaga in Spain after their presumably UK holiday. And one of the last people to get on the plane, I thought he was Spanish, but it turned out after chatting to him, he was actually from Iran. He said, I prefer to call it Persia, but you know it's Iran. And we got chatting, and he was actually heading out to Spain, not on holiday, but he was actually an architect, and he was going out to project manage some of the buildings that he was responsible for. And he asked what I did, and I said, well, I'm currently doing artwork for a book about fairies and things. And so I started talking about various fairy stories that I'd researched, and that made him open up a little bit, and he started to then share a private story that perhaps he would have never shared with anyone, but I think he felt comfortable in kind of discussing it with me. And when he was a young man, when he was back in Iran, and I would put this in the late 70s, early 80s, he said he was out patrolling the streets at night as a young soldier, conscripted soldier, with his army buddy, and a sandstorm blew up, and so they both decided to seek shelter, and they headed for a mosque and decided to go into this mosque for shelter for the rest of the night. And as is customary in mosques, they took their shoes off, and they both decided to try and take it in turns to sleep through the night. And his army buddy decided to sleep on the floor with this guy who I call Hussein, for want of a better name. He said that he sat beside him against the wall. He had a gun. But unfortunately, he kept falling asleep throughout the night. And he kept waking up and thinking, I must not keep falling asleep. I must not keep falling asleep. And he kept dropping off asleep. And on the third time, he woke himself up and thought, I must not keep falling asleep. But on the third time he woke up, he said he noticed a woman crouching down, looking at his feet. And beside her was a girl he thought to be about 15 or 16, looking at his friend's feet. And they were staring intently at the feet. And he thought, who the hell are they? Where did they come from? So he decided to try and wake his friend up by pressing his elbow on the guy's chest, on his buddy's chest, to wake him up. And he wouldn't wake up. So he said he started to wrap the strap of his gun around his arm because he was going to make a run for it for some reason, even though he had the gun. And he said the movement of his arm must have disturbed this woman because she suddenly looked up from looking at his feet and looked him straight in the eye. And he said as soon as he made eye contact with her, he knew without a shadow of a doubt that she was not from this world. Something just clicked with him. And he said at that point, the woman stood up and the young girl with her stood up. And they both turned and walked away. And he said as they walked away, he noticed they both had cloven hooved feet, those of a goat, if you like, and they vanished into the wall of the mosque. And when he told me that, a shiver went up and down my spine. Now, when I analysed that story afterwards, and I wrote it down and actually sent it to him because I said I want to include it in a book. So I wanted him to kind of confirm that I'd understood everything that he had told me. And he did. About a month later, he read my email and said, yeah, you got everything right. Just don't tell everybody my name. So I said, that's okay, Mr. Hussein. So basically, one thing I kind of concluded I felt from this experience was that the reason that they were staring at his feet was to them, wherever they came from and whatever they were, the human feet were the oddity because they were staring intently at his feet and his buddy's feet. And they were looking at them and thinking, what are they? And then they stood up and walked away with their cloven hooved feet because to them, cloven hooved feet seems to be the norm, whoever they are, wherever they come from. So what's your thoughts on that, Simon?
Well, a couple of things. And first of all, I really like one element in the story. I love the bit where he starts to rap the gun strap getting ready to run, because forget about the truth or otherwise of his story, but I think it gives the sense, like you said it very well, he had the gun, why was he running? It starts to give us this sense that this was a very unusual happening. So I really like that. It gets the tension starting to go up. And then the other thing to say is there's a long tradition in what we could very loosely call fairy lore, the lore of the supernatural from around the world, that these beings often look just like us, bar for one small thing. And in Western tradition, for example, sometimes it's the ideas they have animal ears instead of human ears. And in Arabic tradition, there is often a reference either to cloven feet, like you have here, or a reference to feet that are backwards. So in other words, the foot is facing around the other way. Now, of course, this is Iran, so this isn't the Arabic world, but I imagine there will be similar traditions like this there, and that this is some kind of jinn tradition. At least that's what it would be in the Arabic world. What the Farsi word is, of course, I don't know. As to them staring at the feet, you've given a very nice version of what they were doing. I suppose that when you come across these beings and they're looking at you at night, it's sometimes because they have worse motives. And I'm sure, Neil, this just reflects your very nice personality. I remembered a story, one of my favourite fairy encounters. This is from Scotland in the very late 19th century, but it was written down by the man in question in the 1930s. And he was remembering when he was a kid, he woke up at night in his bed. And for me, these are perhaps the most interesting fairy encounters I come across. Children at night in bed waking up, okay, and having these experiences. And he looked down on his bed and he said there were these two little women at the bottom of his bed with a sack, and they were talking to each other intently. And at a certain point, one of them realised that he was awake. And this is something that we've already had earlier on in the podcast. And he has this wonderful, wonderful line, which is, I think, my single favourite line from fairy encounter literature. He said, they looked at me like a horse trader looks at a horse. Okay. In other words, they weren't scared. They just saw me as almost a commercial object. And I think it's just a brilliant description. And if I was a young Iranian soldier with no shoes on in a mosque, and I came round to find two unusual women looking at my feet, talk about goosebumps. Yeah.
It's worth mentioning that, again, going back to the subjectivity thing, you mentioned the jinn. So there's the Western idea of fairies, we call them fairies, but if we take the Arabic version of the jinn, maybe they're fairies but with a darker nature.
Or interpreted as a darker nature.
Yeah, interpreted as a darker nature. As indeed the medieval kind of depiction of fairies were quite negative, and the Arabic world view jinn as quite negative.
I think if you go back into any traditional society, the supernatural is just overwhelmingly negative. That would be my guess. So I think still today, if you were to travel in the Arabic world to places where quote unquote civilization is not reached, in other words, places that haven't industrialized, that haven't had the digital revolution, I think if you start to speak to people, you'll find A, that there are many more supernatural experiences, that B, people are far more likely to believe in these experiences. And again, as far as I'm concerned, maybe that reflects their wisdom, not their mistake. And C, that those experiences are far more likely to have a sinister side.
Now, it's interesting because one of the stories I said to this guy on the plane, which prompted his discussion to talk about his foot episode, was taken from the John Walker film, Canadian film director, filmmaker, who made this film called The Fairy Faith, which at the time I'd seen on DVD. We'd bought it off Amazon as part of our research. And I found some of the stories in that quite amazing to listen to. And I think it's available on YouTube in certain parts now, this film, The Fairy Faith, if anyone's interested. But it concerned this guy, I think his name was Steve O'Dale, if memory serves me correct. And I'm usually terrible at names, but I'm pretty sure his name was Steve O'Dale or O'Dell or something like that. And he was a Glaswegian builder in this film. And I'm not sure when it took place, but I would say probably maybe in the 90s, maybe the 80s. This film was made in the early 2000s, so I'm sort of winding it back maybe 10, 15 years. I'm not exactly sure when this encounter occurred. But he was on holiday in Ireland, he said. And he was near a place called Fairy Hill or Fairy Fort or something of that nature. And he said he heard some weird music, which seems to be a common theme in some fairy sightings, the weird music that you can't really trace the source of. And he could hear this weird music, but it also just rained, and the rain had now ceased. And he said a rainbow or something was forming over the valley, and he just sort of stood there as the sun started to shine through the clouds, and thought, what a lovely view that is. And he was really beholding the view in front of him. And whilst he was trying to stare at this view, he said something in his peripheral vision was distracting him. Some movement down here somewhere.
Yeah.
And he thought, no, I'll carry on looking at the view. But all the same, there was still this movement. And he thought, wow, I've just got to see what is annoying me down there. So he looked down and he said this small woman, maybe, I don't know, a foot high, maybe a meter high. I can't remember the height he gave. He said she had brown, leathery looking skin, a brown sort of hat on. And he said she had what appeared to him to be old style sheep shears. And she was cutting around the sole of his shoe. And he said where his shadow extended and stopped, there was the male version of this being, looked similar. And he said they weren't pretty. They were pretty ugly, these creatures. And this is where it gets really weird. And I always tell people to strap in when I'm about to tell them this story, that this male being was literally rolling the guy's shadow up like a roll of paper. And he said he just stared at them and he said, I didn't know what to say. So he just went, oi, like that. And he said they looked at each other as if to say, oh my God, he can see us. And then he went and just vanished like that. And he said, I dread to think what would have happened to me had I not seen them. And they continued this procedure, whatever they were trying to do, which defies physics, as we understand it, rolling up a shadow on a piece of paper, but then two beings going in a puff of smoke, as we commonly term it, also defies physics. So there's many things that defy our laws of the universe as we understand it. But this guy reported it, and he was bravely saying it on camera as well and putting his name to it, which I thought was interesting. Do you remember this account at all?
Right, so I've watched this documentary, and it's interesting that is the only account I remember from the documentary, because it's just so unusual and really superb as a story. It's a little bit like the story you told about these two soldiers in the mosque. It really stands out.
Yeah.
And I'm doing the Fairy Census, so I get all these accounts coming in. And one of the things I try very hard not to do is I try hard not to filter. People are sending me accounts. They're saying this happened, that happened. I try basically to accept everything. And the result is that sometimes I have the sense that people are lying. It doesn't happen often, but for example, of the 500 accounts in the first Fairy Census, there are 2 or 3 where I would put money on the fact that someone just decided to be too clever by half and just made up a story, maybe as a joke with his friends, or said to his wife, let's see if I can get away with this. And yet, if I had a story like that, I would believe it absolutely. That doesn't mean that I necessarily believe there were these 2 figures, but that this man had this experience. It's just, who would make that up? I mean, if you're going to make up a fairy experience, that's not how you do it.
Yeah.
It goes back to what I was talking about before of the deep weird. It's just without precedent. It's so unusual. And I think that the documentary maker, I mean, of course, we deserve our luck, but I think he did very well to get that on camera and to get that story into his film.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what happened to the guy, Steve Odell, whether he continued his employment as a builder after that film, but be interesting to see if he still sticks by it. But the fact he was prepared to go on record and state it, but it makes you wonder that I'd done research into accounts from the hereafter, life after death, mostly from the different accounts and different sources, but there was a guy called Leslie Flint who used to manifest in seance room the voices of the dead. Literally, you could hear the voices of famous people being heard in this room. We actually interviewed Andy, Leo Bonomo, who actually went to one of the Leslie Flint seances, and he said that he was distinctly heard a voice moving around the room during this seance. And he got the distinct impression that a military guy or someone of high importance on Earth was walking about the room. And he said it wasn't even in the dark. He said he could just sense this voice going up and down the room. But this Leslie Flint, the medium who produced this phenomena, when these people would come through and talk about life in the hereafter, in the spirit world, a good deal of them, when questioned, would say, there's no sun here. There's no sun. We don't know where the light comes from. It seems to come from everywhere, which I thought was interesting. And when my mum passed over back in 2016, obviously we were all really upset that she died and everything, but not long afterwards, which we kind of expected to happen because we're that way of thinking, I suppose, my brother had a dream where she returned. And in the dream, she came back to us and we all went down to the pub to have a big family meal together. And then we returned to the family home and she says, I've now got to go back. I've got to go back to the spirit world. But she started to go up the staircase and she goes, one of my brothers in the dream said, will you come again? She goes, yes, I will come back to the land of shadows. Which I thought was a really interesting thing to say in the dream. I will come back to the land of shadows. Because then I started to think, well, hang on, these accounts of people in the spirit world that don't have a sun, a celestial body that illuminates their world, the light seems to come from everywhere, which suggests it's their shadows there. Because in their world, if the light has come from everywhere, how can you have a shadow? Because the light has got to come from a direction to cast a shadow. And then you got these weird little beings in Ireland with Steve Odell who are trying to take his shadow. Like, is a shadow a valuable commodity? Like little Ferengis, whatever they may be. I was just trying to put it all together and trying to come up with some sort of answers. And of course, you never do. But I was just trying to see if there's any weird connections. Why would they consider a shadow of importance to them? Why would they want to steal it? And how could they steal it? It's a very bizarre thing.
Bizarre. Yeah. Makes you wonder, because I mean, it does make sense if it's, we're in a physical reality within a universe hurtling around a giant star that is basically the sun. But if you're in like a spiritual dimension, that would suggest that maybe it's not a kind of like a planet-based thing, but it is literally some kind of dimension.
They describe them as spheres, the higher spheres, upper spheres, and lower spheres. So on the next world, if you like, you got the spiritual astral sphere or whatever it's called, the heavenly plane or whatever you want to call it. Then there's higher spheres than that one. So if it's on a sphere, you think, oh, well, some sort of planet world or something, you know. But they talk about higher spheres where there's more advanced souls. And then there's lower spheres where you got really kind of horrible people or something you don't want to mix with, and they seem to be on the lower dimensions as other people, but or lower spheres. But the people from a higher sphere can go down to a lower sphere, or a lower evolutionary sphere, perhaps, be a more correct Richard Dawkins kind of way of describing it. Whereas the people in the lower sphere can't go up to the higher one unless somehow they're spiritually advanced in some, or learn some sort of spiritual advancement in some.
And I can understand that, because why would you want a bunch of thieving morons living next to you coming into your house? You want to lock the doors and keep them out.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're all shoved onto the same sphere on this particular world. All the goodies and the baddies, we're all mixed up in a big pot puree of spirituality. But yeah, so, was there bizarre cases? You talked about the two women sitting on the guy's bed with a bag. Now, it sounds like that they were there to collect something because they've got a bag with them. Would you perceive that, Simon?
Yeah, and remember that in fairy tradition, there's this very strong tradition of the changeling. And the idea behind the changeling is that the fairies will come in the night and steal you, typically a child, but not always, and they will replace you with a form that looks exactly like you. And your parents will come in the morning and they will see that you look a bit different and you're acting strange, but okay, you're still there. But actually the fairies have stolen you away to their own world. And so this business by which fairies come in the night and children see them, this guy may have grown up in a traditional community where he'd already learned that the appearance of the fairies in the night might be a very, very bad thing.
Yeah, now it's interesting because we talked about the UFO stuff and the alien ET connection in part 1, and Jacques Vallée, what's his name? Jacques
Vallée.
Vallée, that's it. Thanks, Andy. Who is a French UFO researcher, well-respected author, researcher, investigated many cases. I think he was one of the first people that I'm aware of, anyway, that likened or could see kind of connections between fairy stories and those of alien abductions. And in the alien abduction scenario, they're coming along and taking your DNA and making new versions of you, i.e. hybrids, which sounds almost like the fairies making a hybrid baby. There's parallels to be drawn, I think, really. And it could be the interpretation of these small creatures coming along, swapping you over during the night. Lots of abductions seem to happen in the night, and taking your DNA or changing you, making another version of you, i.e. a hybrid baby of sorts, but a cross between a human and an alien. And they also say that aliens, ETs, have this ability to do screen memories over you, which I don't know if that's something that the fairies can do, or whether, that they will sometimes they will appear to children as like cartoon characters. Some witnesses have described aliens as their favorite, like Daffy Duck or Warner Brothers cartoon character or something, just to make them appear friendly. And in the film, or was it the series, Taken, Steven Spielberg series with alien abductions and things, one of the characters, the kids in the thing, is taken away by a big friendly bunny rabbit, which is actually an ET, but masquerading as a friendly bunny rabbit to get him his confidence and his, to go with him somewhere. So I do kind of wonder whether, during the ages we're interpreting these fairies for something else, or maybe that fairies are now masquerading as aliens to move in with our technological advancement, wherever fairies are. Yeah.
Look, I'm just looking at the moment through the Fairy Census for an account that really sums this up well. But of course, I'm having problems finding it. Inevitably, it's hiding away from me. Let's give it just another second here. I absolutely agree with that. I think that Jacques Vallée understood this connection. Perhaps other people had intuited it already, and he was quite aggressive. In a sense, I think people interpret what Jacques Vallée did as merging these two worlds together, as saying that the fairy world and the UFO world are similar. But in a sense, he annexed the world of UFOs, I think, to fairies. And he he found all these parallels between them. And of course, you can expand them. You can start to look at the parallels between, say, demonology and fairies, demonology and aliens. But particularly when you get to this business of night, one of the questions on the Fairy Census is what time of day did the experience take place? There are a lot of experiences between midnight and 3 a.m. Let's put it like that. And so nighttime has always been this special occasion. I feel a complete failure here. I'd wanted to find you this account, but I can't find it. But it's basically a young American girl who remembered when she was a little kid that the fairies used to come to her and that she had great respect for doctors. And so they used to dress up in doctors' uniforms and do medical procedures on her. And I mean, here we really are in some of the modern ideas about ufology and alien encounters and the like. I'm sorry I've not been able to find it. But just to give you an idea, and the little fairy nurses used to be dressed like 1950 nurses with the Red Cross on their hats. And they used to go and get samples of her blood and everything. And it's a lovely example of how, I mean, it's very similar to what we learn from these abduction or experimentation cases. I find sleep very interesting because if I get 100 people, if I'm giving a lecture to 100 people in a room, there are 3 things that happen in sleep, which are, if you like, paranormal. And just think about it in terms of your own experiences. I've only had really 1.5 of these experiences, but what's interesting about them is they're so common. The first experience is the experience of falling asleep and hearing voices. And this is something that I think happens to lots of people, that you're falling asleep, and as you're falling asleep, you're passing out, you begin to hear voices. I always hear my father's voice for some reason when I'm falling asleep. The second experience is the experiences of going to sleep or waking up and having visions. And lots of the Fairy Census include periods when people are falling asleep or when they're waking up in the morning. I've only ever had this happen once to me, but I had a terrifying experience about 2 years ago where I woke up to find a tarantula walking over my wife's face.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And she's terrified of spiders, so I desperately tried to get it off her, and it fell down the back of her shirt, and she then woke up because I was putting my hand down her back. And of course, then I realised it was impossible. We're in Italy. But that's another example. And the third example of experiences, paranormal style experiences in sleep, I'm sure you're both familiar with this, if only at second hand, is the experience of paralysis, particularly with the weight on the chest, which is so often associated with nighttime visitors, that someone comes through the door. In Fairy Census 1, there's one beautiful one of an American soccer player who's asleep. He's in his late teens. He wakes up, he can't move, but he can just lift his eyes and he sees this little figure walk into the room with a head that looks like a lemon. And this figure walks over to him. It's a brilliant description. And if you get 100 people in the room, I think something like 40 or 50 of the 100 will have the experience of hearing voices when they fall asleep. Something like 10, 15 will have the experience of occasional visions on falling asleep or waking up. And then you have a smaller number, but nevertheless, people who relatively frequently have this experience of paralysis. And sleep is a period where we're really hostage, I think, to a lot of unusual experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's really where the subconscious starts to turn on and engage the main driver's seat, really. And you're kind of it's beck and call, really, of whatever it decides to do. I have managed to come awake within dreams. They call it lucid dreaming a number of times. I can't say I do it on a regular basis because I haven't really mastered the art of it. I more like stumble into it somehow and become awake. But I have taken with me a determination to find out, because I've said this to other people in other interviews, when you dream, can you tell me where the light is coming from in your dream scenario? So if you're walking down the street, for instance, in the dream, can you tell me where the sun is? Can you see the light? No one bothers to question it, you see. And because I looked at this thing about, is there a light or a source of light in the spirit world, i.e. a sun? They say no, it seems to come from everywhere. I was determined to try and find out if the same happens in our sleep, in our dreams. And I actually managed to come awake in a lucid state in a dream. And I thought, right, I'm going to find out, is there a sun, some sort of illuminational object in my dream? And in the dream, I could see like a roof of like an old barn or something where the bits of thing had dropped through. So therefore, I was looking through to the sky through this barn. And why it presented that way, I don't know. And all I felt, this is the weird thing, I felt all I was allowed, this is the weird, allowed to see was this tiny, tiny pinpoint of light, like a star through this barn. Right. So in other words, the barn was stopping me from seeing the Matrix, if you like, or whatever. And then they said, we'll only show you one little pixel of the computer screen that is your dream, and that's what I perceive to be a star. But I mean, it'd be great to hear from anyone that does see the sun or the sunset in a dream. But I remember seeing a guy do a talk, a thing I went to years ago. I think his name was Dr. Keith Hearn. He's probably retired now. But he looked at dreams and things like that. And he said there's weird things in dreams that you cannot do, which is common to people in dreams. You can't seem to switch a light on or off in a dream. It just doesn't work, which is interesting. Again, back to this light scenario. And he said also, if you read a book in a dream or a newspaper headline, and then you look away to talk to another dream character, and then you go back to read the book, it's not the same.
I've had that experience.
Yeah.
I've had the experience of trying to read things in dreams because maybe it's a part of the story in the dream, the narrative. But when you actually read it, you can't. It doesn't quite work. It's like you say, it's if the pixels don't come together. There isn't that level of concentration. I mean, lots of things to say, Neil, to this. But just perhaps one thing that happens in the Fairy Census, and I don't know what you both think about this, but in the first Fairy Census, a couple of people actually wrote in with dreams that they had, and they saw these as fairy encounters. And in the second Fairy Census, this has become really quite a lot more common. I think maybe there are 15 or so of the 500 are actually people saying, look, I met a fairy in a dream. And I suppose to some extent it makes sense that, you know, these are these very intimate, strong experiences. We know how powerful dreams can be. And people interpret these as well as supernatural experiences.
Yeah, in the same way that psychic part of your brain is operating at a different level. The dreams, I think, are just as valid, really, just because they're inner experiences. And, you know, you can't write, well, you can write them down on paper, but they're never the same. They always be retranslated once they're put down on paper. But you have to tell someone the dream in some way. And as soon as you tell someone the dream, it's lost. So much of that data is missing, that experience of the dream itself. But I suspect, you know, like people have had dreams of ETs and aliens and all sorts of things, of loved ones returning to them in the dream. It seems like a kind of, it's like a virtual world, really, for everyone to meet at, if you like, in some mindscape, whether it's ETs, aliens, or fairies, or dead relatives.
But look, I really like that example. I've never thought of that in relation to the Fairy Census. But this business of dead relatives, the experience that you were describing of your mom, actually, that's one area where we wouldn't hesitate to talk of it as a supernatural experience. Because in our culture, we're used to this idea that the dead can use sleep to communicate with us. I was reading just the other day about a poor man with a very serious illness, very unpleasant illness, who committed suicide and after visited a friend in the dream. And this was the supernatural experience. And I don't know, with fairies, I suppose I'm not used to the idea, but you're absolutely right. With the dead, we just take this for granted that this is one of the avenues of communication.
Yeah, it's because our ego is down and not challenging it. And when you're faced with weird things in dreams, like letters falling off a page or a dog changing into a cat or something like that, you just accept it in a dream. You're not going to sort of say, "Oh, that's weird. It doesn't obey the rules of reality." You don't even, in dreams, you do all sorts of weird things, flying and everything. So everything's up for grabs in the dream.
Everything's up for grabs. Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of other things that you can't do in dreams. Apparently, you can't see your nose, so that's something you can't see in dreams, and you can't flick light switches. I don't know why.
Yeah. We just said that, light switches. Yeah, that's because you haven't paid your bill.
But going back to the illumination thing, this is quite interesting. A lot of people say that when they see spirits or ghosts, ghosts are self-illuminating. They have their own light form. So it kind of like begs the question, within the spirit world, let's assume that there is a spirit world, is it kind of like a self-illumination thing? Is it, people often say when you pass over, you go into the light, you go into the spiritual light.
Yeah.
Sorry, Neil.
Go on. No, go on, Simon.
In the history of religion, there are some writers who have described the different characteristics of supernatural beings, and there are two universals. One is that supernatural beings are luminescent. They illuminate themselves. They have light that comes out of them. And the second is that they have the ability to move through the air. They fly. And this comes up in account after account. And going back to Andy's comments about cave paintings earlier, I mean, even in the earliest cave paintings, you often have these flying figures that seem to be in some way illuminated. There are colours placed around them. And it would be interesting if these were two universals, this idea of flight, but also this idea of illumination. And we talked about the Wollerton gnomes earlier. And in that book, I wrote an essay called Dark Thoughts on the Wollerton Gnomes, because what absolutely blew me away about the experience was that I'd always imagined that it happened at twilight and these kids ran into these gnomes. But actually it happened an hour after the sun had gone down, and they went into a very dense bit of woodland. And this was one of the big problems with the encounter. How do you explain the fact these kids can see in the pitch black? And Marjorie Johnson, again, this woman I keep citing, she explained that fairies, as far as she was concerned, were self-luminescent, that the fairies were, if you like, or these gnomes in their cars, would glow in the dark. And so this is a theme that always comes up in the supernatural, and very often with fairies too.
Now, it's also interesting about the Wollerton gnomes is that they were driving around in these cars, and the cars were slightly almost like dreamlike cars, because they were cars, yes, but they seemed to hover or fly over logs. But didn't they have triangular headlamps or something, if I recollect correctly?
Right. The kids described them in a bit of a strange way. And I can't quite remember the words they used, but they talked about the lights being a little bit strange. They also said that there wasn't a driving wheel, but there was a kind of
a joystick or something, or
it's too early for joysticks, but it was a kind of a metal bar. That's not how it was described, but it wasn't a normal steering wheel. And the other thing was that when the gnomes wanted to move, they shifted their bodies to move. Yeah. And my reaction on reading this was that they were describing bumper cars. You know, the way, again, we probably grew up with this in the 80s, but if you went to the bumper cars, they didn't actually have a normal steering wheel. And you went from side to side as you banged into your friends.
I think that was the G-force of it, wasn't it? As you get thrown about. So maybe the same was happening to the gnomes.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe these kids, and this is always the interesting thing with the supernatural, maybe we're back to tulpas, or maybe it's just that we interpret the impossible with what we know. This was the closest they were able to register all this. Or maybe they just made it all up. I mean, there are so many possibilities.
One of the other things I found interesting about the Wollerton Gnomes case is that they came out just as it got dark. Now, seances typically take place in the dark, and when you have a physical seance, i.e. a manifestation of a spirit, a physical spirit of ectoplasm, so it's said, they can only take place in a darkened room, so they normally have to have an infrared light, which is a certain frequency that for some reason this ectoplasm is safe to view. If you switch on the normal light, this ectoplasm degrades or diminishes or vanishes back into the medium, apparently, and causes them harm. So they have to make the room safe from the light. So they typically do these seances at night, but they black out the windows and they make sure no one has any torches or watches, anything that can reflect light. And then they have these infrared lights where a manifestation can take place. Now, it's interesting, the Wollerton Gnomes takes place after dark, just as it's gone dark. There's a part where they wouldn't go, apparently. The gnomes were chasing them, if I recollect it. They were chasing them, but when the kids got to like a street lamp, the cars or the gnomes wouldn't go near the street lamp for some reason. It's like it was, I think one of the kids described it as if they felt it was going to cause them harm in some way, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if you recollect that.
Right, so I think that the encounter breaks down into two parts. There are these 11 kids. They go into Wollerton Park after it's closed. And these kids seem to have been lovable tearaways. I mean, they weren't playing by the rules at all. And you say it was just after dark. It was a good hour after dark. And they go down the back of Wollerton Park. I've got the map in my head because we went through this stuff so often. And at a certain point, there were a series of trees called the swamps. So they're in a big field, essentially. But just off to the side, there's a fence. And it's basically the kids aren't supposed to go in there. And this group of 11, 4 of the older kids seem to have dared each other to go in. And these 4 kids climb through the fence and go into the wood. Now, remember, this is a night with cloud cover. There's not a full moon, so it's very dark. The only light is coming from distant street lamps, 200 or 300, probably 300 or 400 yards away. And these 4 kids go in, and it's there that they have the encounter. And I've always had a sixth sense that a very important part of the encounter is that one of the boys falls down, slap into the mud. And that either seems to trigger the encounter, or maybe they need an excuse to explain why he got so muddy, or maybe, but it seems to be all 3 kids when they're interviewed remember it very, very clearly. This business of Patrick falling down in the mud. The gnomes are then running around, and it seems to be this Marx Brothers rather strange scene with them all banging into each other. And then the kids leave, and outside there are then the younger brothers and sisters who've been waiting for them. And what happens next is they leave the park, they're going towards the gateway, and at that point the gnomes chase them. And in fact, one of the younger kids starts crying. It seems to have been a bit of a tense situation, but it's not clear. Really, it's not as vivid as what happened in the wood. In other words, it may have been just noises in the bushes. The kids don't describe the gnomes in a very vivid way, whereas when the 4 kids were together in the wood, they describe it in lockstep. They describe it in great detail. And this is one of the slightly worrying things about the account, that there were 4 kids in there, 3 of the kids are interviewed, and the interviews are strangely similar on a lot of points. And, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't an experience, but it's something else to add to the mix.
What I found bizarre about it, they all described the beards of these gnomes of having like little red tips or something at the end. I don't know if you recollect that.
Right. I think that they all did. 2 of them did, and one of them said that it was black at the end. There were these strange little differences. Also, the thing that always has stood out in my mind, the teacher, the headmaster asked all of the 3 kids, how many of these cars were there? All 3 of them said 30 cars, 60 gnomes.
That's weird, isn't it? How would they manage to count them? Yeah.
I mean, there's also a straightforward explanation. Well, perhaps there are several straightforward explanations, but one of them could be what we call secondary elaboration. There's 3 or 4 kids. This happened Sunday evening. Monday, they get to school. They tell everyone, you can imagine. And while they're talking to each other, they start to confirm the details. I mean, it would happen to the 3 of us. If we went out tonight and had a UFO experience, not of the third kind, but we see a UFO, it hovers overhead. And we went and sat down in a cafe and began to exchange details, the details would be different. But after an hour of talking, we would start to agree on points. It's a very human reaction. And sometimes you do have this with supernatural encounters.
Interesting. Well, I think we're going to have to draw this to a close now. But it's been a fascinating discussion, all things gnomes and spirits and fairies and things like that. So Simon, people obviously want to find out, hopefully, about more about your work and the things you've got coming out. You've got a podcast you mentioned. Do you want to give listeners and viewers information of where they can find out more about the Wollerton Gnomes and your own write-ins and your podcasts and things?
Right. Well, in the amateur tradition of podcast, I've just successfully kicked my microphone out.
Okay.
So we're now on my bad microphone. I'm going to take my earphones out because they've gone dead.
Okay.
I'll speak to you as a normal human being. So let me just run past a couple of things. First of all, I have a podcast, or rather we have a podcast, because I do this together with an American researcher, Chris Woodyard. And we look there we do it once a month. We're not as ambitious as you guys. And we look for about 40, 50 minutes. We talk about a supernatural case. We did, for example, an episode on the Wollerton Gnomes. So that's one of the things that we do. And I think many of your listeners would find some of our podcasts anyway entertaining. And it's Boggit and Banshee. Boggit and Banshee. And the name is because my most important academic work has been on the Boggit. And Chris, for whatever reason, identified as a Banshee, probably because the two names go together. And then there's the Fairy Census. And if you just go to Google, and Andy, this is the name that amused you before, but my website for fairy lore is called The Fairiest, believe it or not.
I like it.
And if you type into Google Fairy Census, the first page that will come up is the page of The Fairiest, where there is the Fairy Census. You click on it, and there you can do the survey yourself. You go in with an experience you've had. You answer the questions. Please be patient. You put your experience down. You click go, and this will then appear in Fairy Census 3. Wow. This will be 2 or 3 years down the road from here. As far as Fairy Census 1 goes and Fairy Census 2, Fairy Census 1 and Fairy Census 2, well, Fairy Census 1 is and Fairy Census 2 will be available as a PDF. And if you go to that page, you can just download it for free there. And it's something like 3 books worth. It's 200,000 words. So it's a lot of experience. I also, for Fairy Census 2, I'm combining both censuses in an Excel sheet with all the data points. And this will also be freely available on my website. And here I'm just going to have my Delia Cook moment, Delia Smith moment, and hold up. There is also a published version of the Fairy Census. And because they're just so big, there are 3 separate volumes for Fairy Census 1. There'll be 3 separate volumes for Fairy Census 2, 200,000 words. And they're basically broken down. I think it's the first volume's Britain and Ireland, the second volume's North America, the third volume's Australasia, Europe, and the rest of the world. So these are the different ways you can get me. But again, I stress, it's available free of charge as a PDF. No one has to pay anything. And it's very useful for searching and so forth. And so this is how you can track me down. And then I've done lots of writing on the supernatural, which is all gathered on my site, academic site, which is Facebook for academics, is called Academia. And so if you put Simon Young, academia.edu, you'll find my page. And there again, freely available, all the articles that I've written on fairies, witches, ghosts, even little bits on aliens, but not very much.
Brilliant. Oh, there's a mammoth amount of things for people to get their teeth into then. So that's brilliant. Well, we'll have to listen out to your podcast at some point. And if you need Andy or I to be a guest on it to discuss stuff, I'm sure we'll be happy to do so when you're needing some Fruit Loops like me and Andy to to discuss strange stuff with. Anyway, once again, thank you to Simon Young for staying up late, speaking from Italy. I hope it's not too hot out there. It's very hot back here in the UK at the minute, so we're probably getting some very Mediterranean weather. So thank you once again for joining us, and thank you, Andy, for joining us. What are your plans for next month, Andy? Anything you want to promote?
Yes, we are in Halloween season, fast approaching, and so this is the most busiest manic season ever. If people are interested in psychic events, we're having a lot of Halloween specials at pubs and clubs and things. Go on to Tuned In Events. So Tuned In Events on Facebook and Instagram. and see what we're up to.
Excellent. Gosh, it whizzes past.
It does.
I can't get over
Christmas soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much indeed, once and all, and join us again next time on the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Good night, all.
Take care.
You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, voted #1 for paranormal podcasts in the UK.